with their loved ones, support and time to process the emotions that arise, human connection with people they know and trust, spiritual support and connection, time to explore the complexity of the human dynamics that arise, quality of life as they define it, and healthcare professionals brave enough to go on the journey with them. So how do we get there? How do we create this world where people of all ages live well in the face of serious illness? To see the road ahead, it's important to know the history and the context in which the movement lives. So I'm going to walk us through decades of modern healthcare from the 1940s to today, to look at each decade in the light of the context, the culture of healthcare, and the relationship of serious illness. It's kind of like nesting dolls. And I want to do a shout out to Teresa Drought, who is a bioethicist with Kaiser, who created the framework that I'm going to use to walk us through those decades. And as we go through the decades, I want you to think about how this relates to you, your family, and your community, however you define your community. Where am I supposed to be pointing this? Okay. So in the 1940s, some folks in this room were alive at that point in time and have vivid memories of that. Everything was shaped by World War II. The entire decade was shaped by World War II. The war started out in Europe and came to U.S. soil with the bombing of Pearl Harbor. The draft was instituted, and it touched every family in the U.S. Everybody was impacted. Everyone did their part for the war movement, pulling things together. Everyday staples, including sugar, gas, and rubber, were rationed. Everyone made sacrifices for the greater good and for the common purpose of winning the war. So what was happening on the side with respect to health care? Employer-sponsored health insurance was started in the 1940s as a result of federal law, the Stabilization Act, which limited employers' ability to raise wages. So they had to get creative about how they could reward their employees, and paying for health insurance didn't count as wages. Epidemics were a real issue at that time, with soldiers returning from abroad who brought back diseases that threatened to become epidemics, such as influenza, polio, and malaria. And those diseases were really growing at the time. So in response to this threat of epidemics, there was a proliferation of new drugs. Antibiotics came into common use and were seen as a magic bullet. Here's this condition that really threatens a massive group of people, and we had the magic pill, the magic bullet to solve it. Sulfa drugs were created. Penicillin became produced on a massive scale. The Centers for Disease Control were created, the precursor to it, which made sense as we're looking at epidemics and how do we address these issues on a societal level. And medicalization started to occur, where it wasn't just every doctor being a generalist, but some doctors starting to specialize. Nursing, likewise, was starting to move into a more technical field of professional work. With respect to our relationship with serious illness, the threat of death was over everybody's head, either for themselves or someone they knew, someone they loved. At the same time, there was this huge optimism that things could get cured, that we could get out ahead of disease, and that we could prevent these things, and there wouldn't be any more. Certain illnesses would just be eradicated. Some people might remember how common tonsillectomies became, and it was part of that thinking. So then we moved on from the 40s, then flowed into the 50s. And the 50s was really this post-war expansion. Thanks. The economy boomed. People had more money. Demand for housing in the suburbs was created. Baby boom. Probably many of us here, part of that baby boom generation. TVs became a household item, creating a common visual story about everyday life. All of this led to the beginning of the consumer-led economy that seemed to have no end. The Cold War military-industrial complex was created. It was this combination of the military needing to be strong and fighting this Cold War against the Soviet Union. After World War II, there were two strong powers. It was the Soviet Union and the US, and we both had nuclear arms, and we both knew that we could create a nuclear holocaust. So we had to be strong to prevent the other one from following that path. So it created this this partnership between the military and our technology industries, which we call the military-industrial complex. My dad, in all of his years as an engineer, was really working in part of that industrial military complex. So with healthcare, we saw this boom because there was federal funding for research and for hospitals, fueling an expansion. The first polio vaccine was introduced to the general public, making huge strides with the fight against polio. Ventilators changed from being an iron lung, which was a machine that your entire body was in up to your neck, to the ventilators and the various ventilators that we have today. The first organ transplant in the US occurred in Boston. Huge advances in heart disease and cardiac treatment. There were new procedures that were developed, and they could stop the flow of blood while they did a surgery. Artificial valves were implemented. Electrical shock was employed to control heartbeats, leading to the creation of pacemakers, like we heard from Katie Butler. And by the end of the decade, open heart surgery was an everyday activity in healthcare. The structure of the DNA was discovered. So what was happening with this booming economy, this booming and this potential within healthcare? What was happening with our relationship with serious illness? Not a whole lot, but the one thing that does stand out is from a corner of our movement that you probably wouldn't have expected it to come from. It was Pope Pius XII at the time, who spent a lot of time talking with healthcare providers, clinicians, and the public about health issues. He took on difficult topics, such as the rights of the family members to make decisions against medical advice. He differentiated between ordinary treatment and extraordinary treatment. That we have an obligation to try to address serious illness and terminal illness, but we don't have an obligation to go to extreme measures in order to prevent death. He was the first to introduce the concept of double effect. That the use of medicine in terminally ill patients is justified, even if it may shorten the patient's life, as long as shortening the life is not the objective itself. I'm just going to pause in between each of the decades to give you a little time to think and to process that, and if you want to jot any notes. So we had the 40s with the World War II and everybody pulling together. A successful victory at the end leads to this booming economy and booming healthcare, and that goes into the 60s. The 50s generally known as a time of compliance and conformity, but with some seeds of rebellion that really took hold in the 1960s. In the 1960s, it was characterized on a political front by lots of political and social unrest. We had JFK's assassination, Martin Luther King was assassinated, the Vietnam War was going on. Social norms were changing. We had changes in clothing, hairstyles, music, formalities, schooling. It went on and on and on. This created a generation gap. Who here remembers the saying, never trust anybody over the age of 30? That would be the vast majority of us in this room at this point in time. So every institution was under pressure to change. There were numerous movements. We had this anti-war movement, the civil rights movement, the gay movements, the feminist movement. Pretty much every movement that you can think of had huge traction at that time. There was counterculture that was taking hold. We had the hippies, the drug culture, and alternative lifestyles was a concept that was introduced to society at that point. Maybe not everybody needs to live the same way. At the same time, economic growth was strong. In fact, the U.S. experienced the longest uninterrupted period of economic expansion in the 1960s. Things were good, but things were changing. On the healthcare front, there were new developments, including hemodialysis for end-stage renal disease, using tubes to circulate and filter the blood. CPR was developed and became a standard part of first aid treatment. ICUs, intensive care units, became a standard part of hospitals. Chemotherapy had been around, but it actually had not been accepted by the healthcare community until there was a study on acute pediatric leukemia that showed that cancer could impact that disease in a positive way. And that turned the tide and led to what became common use of chemotherapy, as well as the National Cancer Program. Medicare and Medicaid were created. So we had this, at the federal level, policy and funding now, coverage, health insurance for everyone who was old and everyone who was poor. So kind of leaving the in-between to be solved through employer-sponsored insurance, but definitely the poor and the old had something to rely on. And there were funding mechanisms, there were, the reimbursement, the regulation has driven a lot of the shape of healthcare because the federal government now became the largest healthcare payer. And what was happening with our relationship with serious illness? Still not a whole lot. We're pretty much focusing on the potential that we have to cure diseases and ailments. Death seen as a failure, something we want to fight against. We can keep doing our research, we can keep doing our treatments, we can solve these things. But we had some seeds that have become the seeds for the palliative care movement planted at that time, including Cicely Saunders, who created the first hospice in the UK, and Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, who wrote her seminal book on death and dying. So then this time of radical change in the 1960s led into the 1970s. And what did we see in the 1970s? Some people have called it the me decade, meaning that instead of society shaping the individual, which was more kind of the culture in the 40s and the 50s, the individual was shaping society. So this shift in kind of some of the fundamental ways that society is functioning. We had political and national crises. We had the oil crisis, the energy crisis, Watergate. The Vietnam War was dragging on. It destroyed the idealism of the 60s. The economy slowed down. We had stagflation, which is inflation and unemployment rising at the same time. We did have some technological advances. We had fiber optics, microwaves, microprocessors, the pocket calculator, VCRs, cable TV, MTV, all developed, changing the way that we relate to media. Apple Computer and Microsoft were founded in the 70s. There was also a rise of a consumer movement, placing value on person choice in all settings, in all industries, and direct-to-consumer advertising. There was also kind of related to that was the fitness movement of jogging, working out, biking, and anti-smoking campaigns, so kind of taking control over your own health that partnered well with this consumer movement and consumer mentality. Healthcare grew quite a bit. It grew so much in the 70s that it became second only to the military in size and cost. Medicine started to be seen as a commodity, moving away from this one-on-one relationship with your provider, this professionalism, to this is a business. This is something that I'm buying. It's a service I'm buying. Technological advances in other fields made their way into healthcare, which gave us things like CAT scans and MRIs that allow us to take images of the soft parts of the body. Informed consent started to get traction. You can see with the consumer movement, that makes a lot of sense. Informed consent, the concept that a doctor should inform a patient of the risks, benefits, and burdens before proceeding with a procedure had been around, but it really didn't get traction until the 70s. And you can see that with the rise of the consumer movement, that it made sense. People had higher expectations about their involvement. And in the beginning, doctors were very concerned that if they gave all this information to patients, the patients wouldn't get the treatment that they needed, that they would just forego it altogether. And you probably see that sometimes I look at the drug ads today and I'm like, when they go through all of the risks, and it's like, who would take that? So there's some legitimacy to that concern that they had at the time. The Tuskegee syphilis study came to light. The study began with 600 black men, many of whom were illiterate, and they were told they were going to be treated for bad blood, which in their community meant about one of 6 things. And when it was originally planned to go on for 6 months, it went on for 40 years. And during that time, the men who were participating never were given penicillin, which was proven to be the drug of choice, the treatment of choice in the 1947. So it's not surprising that that gave rise to the standards that we have today for ethics in medical research. Also created some discord, some concern in some of our populations, particularly those who don't have as much power and influence as the dominant society, that maybe healthcare doesn't have their best interests in mind. Roe v. Wade was decided, giving a woman more control over her body. So on the serious illness side, Ann Quinlan her situation made it into the media and started this public dialogue about medical treatment and sustaining life. She was a young woman who had a tragic accident that resulted in her being in a persistent vegetative state, and she was on a ventilator. And after many years, her parents felt that that wasn't the way that she wanted to live. And they had to go to court, and it went up to the New Jersey Supreme Court that ruled that the parents had the right to speak for Karen and to make the decision that she would have made for herself. She was ultimately taken off of the ventilator and lived another 10 years. It was that case that really brought public awareness to this issue, with getting the medical community, the legal community, and the average citizens openly debating this issue. It prompted the first living will laws. There are about 10 states that passed it in that decade. California passed the first one, the California Natural Death Act, giving people the right to document their wishes and get that honored. And the first hospice, a home-based program, was started in the U.S. in Connecticut by Florence Wald. So as I was preparing this presentation, it felt to me like really the 1940s to the 1970s really laid the foundation for our modern healthcare system. And there were a few luminaries during that time that planted seeds for what would become the palliative care movement. But they really stood out in this vast sea of medical advances institutional developments that were moving in a different direction. So I'd like to pause here and ask you, at your tables, turn to your neighbor, groups of 2 or 3, and to talk about, as you think about this time period from the 1940s to the 70s, in the context of you, your family, your community, what stands out to you? Insights, observations, does that fit with your family? Was your family part of this culture? Did you have experiences with healthcare that resonated with this at that war? Was your family having a different experience? So we got another 40 years to get through. So in the 1970s, really was that start of the me decade, and in the 1980s it built on that. It really was a time, the 1980s are remembered as a time of materialism and consumerism that embraced a new conservatism in social, economic, and political life. People were working longer, harder hours. We had families where both parents were working full-time. Kids were letting themselves home into the house and being unsupervised until their parents came home from work. We had yuppies, young, upwardly mobile baby boomers with a college education, well-paying job, and expensive taste. Consumer safety became a concern as well. There were multiple cases in which there was tampering of over-the-counter products, medicines. The anti-drunk driving movement really got traction in the 70s. I mean, the 80s. What am I in here? The 80s. Home computers were introduced. So all of a sudden, we used to have these big, giant rooms that were part of an office. Now we have these little computers that could sit on your desk at home, bringing the power of a computer to your home and personal life. Forever changing our relationship with technology and embedding it in everyday life. As we ended the decade, the Berlin Wall fell, creating and opening up the new era on the political front. With healthcare again was really turning into more of a business. It was no longer seen as a community function like police and fire. It started to mimic the model of corporations, of corporate businesses. Marketing and advertising became key and paramount to their success and survival. We saw vertical integration with hospitals buying medical groups, and with the idea that as a healthcare system, you wanted to be able to provide the full continuum of healthcare so that your patients were always within and under your umbrella. Cost containment was very real, issue that was really discussed at the policy level. It brought us DRGs, diagnostic-related groups, where when a patient is admitted to a hospital, the hospital is paid a rate based on the patient's diagnosis, rather than the actual procedures they receive or the length of stay. HMOs proliferated, managed care took off, and rationing healthcare was actually a discussion that was had at a policy level. Some maybe remember that dialogue got the furthest in Oregon. But there wasn't really the appetite, and there were lots of ethical issues about how that could be institutionalized as a policy. We had the first cross-species organ transplant when a newborn, baby Faye, received a heart from a baboon. We were also grappling with the rights of parents to make decisions for their seriously ill children. So we had a presidential commission that supported the parents' right to refuse medical treatment for their child in most instances. And a year later, Congress passed a law that severely limited the parents' rights to make treatment decisions for a seriously ill or disabled newborn, kind of reflecting how we were conflicted as a society. The AIDS epidemic started in the 1980s, so this was a virus seemingly coming out of nowhere that defied any sort of treatment. It was very scary and created a lot of fear. It also activated a lot of people to get involved in the end-of-life movement. They had friends that were passing away, and they could see that the death that they were having, that we as a society could do better. The Hospice Benefit was created. All of a sudden, Medicare was paying for this. There was this new service line and benefit that was made available to people who were terminally ill. The Joint Commission accredited hospices. The American Heart Association recommended that for patients unlikely to benefit from CPR, that their doctor, in consultation with the patient, issue a DNR order. Likewise, the AMA, the American Medical Association, recommended that in the appropriate circumstances that the doctor could withdraw or withhold medical treatment in consultation with the patient, if that was really the appropriate thing to be doing. So you can see that things were starting to shift. There's a continuing expansion of healthcare and this growing awareness of serious illness, and that we need to come up with some solutions. That went into the 1990s, which are generally considered a time of relative peace and prosperity. In the 80s, right at the end, the Berlin Wall was torn down. That led to the fall of the Soviet Union. That led to the fall and the elimination of the Cold War. We were no longer in this like staring match with the Soviet Union. We had Desert Storm, also called the Gulf War, which happened when Iraq invaded Kuwait. The U.S. joined a coalition of 40 nations for a war that lasted 43 days. Here we are, all the world coming together and quickly having success. It was the rise of the internet which ushered in a radical new era of communication, business, and entertainment. Google came into existence, and we prepared for Y2K, which turned out to be nothing. And smoking bans were becoming common, that we need to kind of think about shared space, such as air. On the healthcare front, we had the Clinton attempt at healthcare reform. A lot of energy, a lot of time, a lot of potential there, but ultimately it didn't pass. And even though it wasn't successful, we did have some key legislation, healthcare legislation that passed at the federal level in the 90s, including HIPAA and CHIP. HIPAA focusing primarily on protecting patient privacy of their medical records, and CHIP, the Children's Health Insurance Program, making sure that seriously ill children have access to Medicaid and other federally funded programs. Medicare and Medicaid fraud now became an issue. With the growth of those two systems, with those two payment mechanisms, there was concern that some people were figuring out how to take advantage of that. And a special crackdown to combat waste and fraud, Operation Restore Trust, was one of many that were started. We started to become enamored with evidence-based medicine. We have all this research, and we see variation. The research showed significant variation among the care that people with similar conditions had, depending on where they lived. And so there was this push towards evidence-based medicine, of making sure that people with the same conditions get access to the best knowledge, to the treatment that's in alignment with the best knowledge that we have. Cloning and Dolly the sheep was created from, not from an egg and sperm, but from DNA. And that prompted stem cell therapy because it meant that an adult nucleus could be turned back to the embryonic stage. In Virginia, a court ruled that hospital personnel cannot deny emergency treatment to an infant born with a severely damaged brain. That was baby K. Also, with respect to end of life, Nancy Cruzan was in the news in the 1970s. She was another young woman in her 20s, got in a car accident. Emergency responders didn't get to her right away. She did go a bit of time without oxygen to her brain, but they did revive her. And she was on a feeding tube. She was in a persistent vegetative state, and her family asked that she be removed from the feeding tube. And it went all the way up to the U.S. Supreme Court. that ruled that competent adults have the right to refuse medical treatment. It didn't resolve Nancy's case, which was remanded back down to the Missouri court to make a decision based on the particular facts, and she actually passed away before they did make that decision. But it did establish firmly in national law that all of us have a right to make our own medical decisions. On the heels of the Cruzan case, the Congress passed the Patient Self-Determination Act, PSDA, which requires that all health facilities ask people on admission if they have an advance directive and give them information about how to complete one. By this point, it was in the 1990s, we finally had advance directives recognized in all 50 states. Robert Wood Johnson Foundation put $29 million into a multi-year, intervention project that was a complete failure in changing how we care for people at the end of life. It didn't make a significant movement in the needle, and that spurred a lot of foundations to jump in and start funding work in this area, including Soros, Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, and the National Institute for Health. The IOM issued their first report, Approaching Death in America, and the Coalition for Compassionate Care was created. So from that time of prosperity and peace, and lots of movement starting to happen in end of life, we go into the 2000s, which actually was quite a time of turmoil politically, followed by financial crisis. The decade started out with 9/11 and an attack on the Twin Towers, probably the most defining moment of that decade, bringing terrorism to U.S. soil. We had the Iraq and Afghanistan wars on terrorism that went on for many, many, many years. California, we had an energy crisis. We had the threat of rolling brownouts and blackouts. Hurricane Katrina happened, which claimed more than 1,800 lives, damages in the hundreds of billions of dollars, and displaced many more people. We had the dot-com bubble, the housing bubble, put us into a recession, and the housing market just crashed. And in the meantime, obesity was really taking hold. Simultaneously with this, it was the golden era of technology. The internet still held a lot of potential for democratizing the economy, and access to information just exploded, kind of leveling the playing field. Cell phones and email became prolific. Probably remember when you got your first cell phone. It really changing the way that we stay in touch. And social media was just starting to get traction, and Facebook was taking hold. With respect to healthcare, we had the human genome. We're completed sequencing of the human genome, which helps scientists to determine the single gene that causes a disease. We developed a cocktail of medicine that fought HIV, turning it from a terminal illness into a chronic condition. And we started to change our focus in healthcare, thinking about public health campaigns on lifestyle, disease management, and transitions in care. Medicare Part D was passed, giving seniors prescription and coverage. With respect to serious illness, the Bill Moyer series was produced on PBS, which led to the creation of a lot of book groups and local coalitions, some of them who continue to exist today, that came to support conversations in the community based on that PBS series. The IOM issued their report on pediatrics and end of life, when children die. The National Consensus Project issued their first set of recommendations, consensus guidelines on palliative care. Terri Schiavo was in the news. At the age of 26, she had an unexplained cardiac issue that left her in a persistent vegetative state. Her husband fought with the parents over what Terry's wishes really were. And after 10 years, he was finally allowed to have her feeding tube removed. But this was after it became a national controversy involving the courts, Congress, and our president. Here in California, the Nick Snow Law was passed, which created the Pediatric Palliative Care Waiver. Palliative care became board certified and medically recognized as a legitimate medical specialty. National Healthcare Decisions Day was created, which, if you don't know, that happens every year on April 16th, the day after tax day, because the only two things given in life are taxes and death. Inpatient palliative care programs started to grow and proliferate, and POLST started to spread across the U.S., including being passed in California. So from the 2000s, then we move into the 2010s, and I would characterize this as kind of a mercurial time as trends become more extremes and assumptions and structures fall away, making life feel more complicated, and technology has sped all of this up. So we have a trend towards virtual connection on the internet. You can connect with pretty much anybody, anywhere, at any time. But at the same time, there's a counter trend to focus more on our local, where we live and work, and making our local communities as strong as possible. California became the first majority state where we didn't have an ethnic or cultural majority in our state. In 2014, Latinos now make up the majority. We had increased informality in all aspects of life, from the way we dress, to business standards, to interpersonal relationships, to communication standards. Smartphones have proliferated, putting the power of a computer in our hands. More people have smartphones than have computers. Twitter and Instagram started to take off and start to become the favored forms of social media. How people stay up to date on the news and the media and current events has changed. We have big data and privacy issues that are coming to the forefront. And we have global warming, which is increasing patterns of experiencing extreme changes in weather patterns, breaking records, and changing sometimes seasons within a single day. And we have, within the White House, we're similarly experiencing a president who likes to make headlines on a regular basis and can set policy in 280 characters and then change the policy in a single day. So just like global weirding or warming, we kind of have this lots and lots of changes happening very, very, very fast. We started out the decade with the Affordable Care Act being enacted, and we're ending it with Obamacare being threatened with dismantling. Telemedicine is gaining traction, bringing that technology that's common in society to help us provide better medical care for people. We've targeted cancer therapy that can target that patient's particular type of cancer and their particular biological structure. We have minimally invasive therapy where we can go into a person's body and do some tremendous healing and surgery without significantly opening the body and exposing it. Bionic limbs, incorporating computers into prosthetics, is taking place. And with respect to end of life, there's a lot of stuff. Again, the end of life movement, the palliative care movement is really getting traction. So we have death cafes and public engagement opportunities taking hold, opportunities for people to eat cake, drink tea, and discuss death. We have a lot more media coverage of serious illness. Death and dying has now actually been worthy of media coverage. At the same time, people are sharing their experiences with serious illness and what they're going through social media, making it much more public. In California, our Secretary of State, Diana Dooley, made a publicly statement that better care at the end of life is a core component of making California the healthiest state in the nation. The IOM issued another report, Dying in America. The billing codes were released for advanced care planning, making it clear that doctors could pay for having these conversations with patients, really legitimizing it, the value of these conversations. In California, we had SB 1004 was passed, and the California Advanced Illness Collaborative standards were also created, which we'll talk more about those tomorrow. And the End of Life Option Act was enacted. So I'd like you again to look at that decades between the 1980s to the 2010s and think about what changes have you seen during that time period that impact the palliative care movement. Well, I hope that you guys will continue this conversation throughout the conference. So here are some of the things that I've noticed putting this together. And that's that change takes time. We're making progress, but it does take time. And what you're doing at your individual job, with each patient you see, with each person you talk to, is connected to the larger movement. We have momentum, and the movement is accelerating. The coalition has been around 20 years through most of this. And like the movement, the coalition itself is gaining momentum. So what's the coalition going to be focusing on the near future? We're going to be focusing on how we bring this information out to the public, tapping and leveraging the authentic voice of the patient. It's called our Humans of Palliative Care initiative, and it's going to be multi-pronged. We've created a video on what is palliative care to help people to understand what it is and try to dispel some of the myths. With the healthcare delivery system, we're working on the pediatric palliative care transition from the Waiver into SB 1004, the consensus standards in SB 1004 implementation. We're going to have a whole panel session on this tomorrow. And we have tools and issues that we're working on that help both the public as well as the healthcare delivery system be on the same page. Our very popular decision aids on CPR, ventilation, hydration, and nutrition have been revised and updated. The language is even better than it was before, so I encourage you to check those out. We worked with Susan Keller and Sonoma County to develop an advanced directive designed by and for people with mental health conditions. Making and thinking, plan and thinking ahead. And there'll be some discussion at that at some of our interactive session. And then we're working on a POLST registry for POLST forms, which you're going to hear more about in a panel presentation later today. Okay, so I was going to show the video. We're running a little bit behind. I'm going to save this for another time, but I'm really excited about showing you the What is Palliative Care video. Oops. So on a policy front, there's a lot happening. We've been doing a lot of work on various issues, and there's a lot more to come. So in this past year, there was some legislation introduced, AB 937, that would have really kind of muddied the water about when your agent or surrogate can speak for you. It was well-intended, but kind of didn't think through what the unintended consequences were. And so the coalition, in collaboration with the California Medical Association, was able to prevent that and stop it from getting codified into law. There's a lot of activity at the policy level around opioids, and some of what's happening, what we're seeing is that there's creating burdens for palliative care providers. There's some recognition that people who are receiving hospice care, that these laws aren't directed to them and that it's not going to benefit those people. But the language in the proposed laws are out of touch and don't cover everybody who is providing care, only those who are getting care under a hospice. So we're out there working for better policy and recognizing that the exemption should be based on the patient's condition of having a terminal illness rather than who their provider is. Pediatric palliative care is a nut that we are working hard to crack to make it more of a viable benefit and service that can be offered to seriously ill kids throughout the state. We're advocating for the release of all of the data that's collected currently on the current forms for the End of Life Option Act. At this point in time, the state was releasing some of that data, but not all of it. And we feel that if people are completing those forms, that data should be, it's respectful to the people who have to complete the forms to release the data. And once we have that, then we can determine whether it needs to keep being collected. At the federal level, we're out supporting PACHETA, which is a palliative care workforce bill. So public policy is one place that we need your help. Still today, 2/3 of the coalition funding comes from grants. And that hampers our ability to vigorously advocate for policy changes that are needed to create what we all want for ourselves, for our loved ones, and the people we care for. Every time you support the coalition's work, whether by being a member, hiring us to conduct a training for your organization, registering for a webinar, coming to the summit, making a donation, you are helping our public policy advocacy to be possible. Has anyone noticed that our new governor is very interested in healthcare? We have opportunities that we haven't had before to move things even further. And at this point, our policy is kind of leading the nation in a lot of ways, and we want to keep staying out front and pushing the envelope. So I appreciate your support. So as we look at the future, it's clear that the problems we face are systems problems. The need for collaboration across organizations, disciplines, backgrounds is needed just as much today as when the coalition started. We need breakthroughs in public engagement, healthcare delivery, and public policy. We need breakthroughs that empower people, align incentives, and solidify our systems so that everyone facing serious illness gets the best care possible. The need for a coalition, one that works with the quiet voices and the powerhouses, still exists. In fact, it's stronger today. The work you do is important. Every interaction, as I said, that you have in your day-to-day work, whoever it's with, whenever it occurs, is part of a larger movement that is transforming our healthcare system and creating that vision, creating into reality a world in which people of all ages live well in the face of serious illness. Thank you.